Let's welcome each other this evening.
Well, as we get started this evening, we're going to take your prayer concerns and get those into the bulletin for If there's not any others, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and turn with me to Genesis 49. We're going to be picking up in verse 29 tonight. We're going to round out our time in Genesis in chapter 50. I do want to share with you this piece of paper. David Ball shared this with me earlier. As many of you know, Cassie Fleming is serving, and we support her through the church. Cassie is serving as a missionary in Papua New Guinea, which is basically an island in just north of Australia. That half of the island is Papua New Guinea and the other half is Indonesia. And so David was sharing this with me about what had gone on recently in Papua New Guinea, saying that lawmakers passed a measure officially recognizing the nation as a Christian country, changing the preamble to reflect a Christian identity and making the Bible a national symbol, which is awesome. And that's wonderful for that country that has happened. And so with us supporting Cassie and having a vested interest, so to speak, in the spiritual well-being of the people of Papua New Guinea, I told David this morning, I said it's even more remarkable when you really think about the fact that the other half of that island and all the other Indonesian islands are a Muslim country. And so it's definitely a something that is noteworthy and definitely to give God praise over that the influence that'll be had there. And so wanted to share that with you this evening. So tonight we are concluding our study of the book of Genesis. We started this study in the book of Genesis on March 27th, 2022. Almost 3 years ago. Now, we've taken breaks. The preacher's not been preaching on Genesis for 3 straight years. But we have divided it up into 4 quadrants and had Bible studies in between. But almost 3 years to the day, we started this series back in 2022. And this time, as we wrap up, this is going to be our last study in the book of Genesis. But tonight, we're going to look at the deaths of Jacob and the deaths of Jacob and Joseph. And so to keep us on track with the biblical timeline, we're going to look at, what we typically do. Now, the events of the earlier part of chapter 49, now we're picking up in verse 29, but that's the stuff that we looked at 2 weeks ago. It happened at the same time as tonight's events at the end of chapter 49. So there's not been any time change in chapter 49, but the end of chapter 50, when we finish up the book of Genesis tonight, between the start of our study in 49 verse 29 to the end of 50, there's a difference of 54 years. And so we go from the death of Jacob to the death of Joseph, and there's a difference of about 54 years. As you see there on the screen, this would put the death of Jacob about 1639 BC, and the death of Joseph around 1585 BC. And so that's sort of where we find ourselves in the biblical timeline, in the timeline of world history. And so tonight we're going to start with verses 29 through 33 of Genesis 49. So follow along with me as we read those. It says, and when it says then he, it's talking about Jacob. It says, then he commanded them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my ancestors in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. The cave is in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. This is the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite as burial property. Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there. And I buried Leah there. The field and the cave in it were purchased from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving charges to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, took his last breath, and was gathered to his people. So remember, last time we talked about Jacob had spent this time blessing each of his sons. And once that was done, he gave them one final charge, one final direction or instruction. And it's the same one that he gave to Joseph back in Genesis 47 And Jacob wanted to be buried in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan. And this was the same cave where Abraham had bought it 170 years before this time in Jacob's life. So it had been 170 years since Abraham bought it at the death of Sarah for Sarah to be buried in. And we read about that all the way back in Genesis chapter 23. Now this cave had become basically a family burial area. It was a rather large cave, and it was much like family cemeteries used to be back in the day. You know, you'd have a 500-acre farm, and you'd have a family cemetery on the farm there, and anybody that died in the family would be buried in those cemeteries, and that was very common. But that's basically what Abraham's family did at this time. And so we're told in the text who all is buried there: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Leah. Now we remember that Rachel, Jacob's wife, or his preferred wife, she died on the way to Canaan right after childbirth with Benjamin. And so she was buried near Bethlehem, or Ephrathah, and Leah eventually dies sometime between the time they arrive in Canaan and the death of Jacob, and so she is buried in that cave as well. Now there is a tradition that states that Adam and Eve are believed to be buried in that same cave, but there's no evidence of it. That's an old Jewish tradition, but there's no evidence of it. There is evidence that Abraham and his family going forward had been buried there. So after Jacob requested of his sons to be buried in the family cemetery, so to speak, what we find is that Jacob got back into the bed, took his last breath, and he died. So look at the beginning of chapter 50 with me, and we're going to see how Jacob's request of his sons is fulfilled. So we're going to look at verses 1 through 14. It says, "Then Joseph, leaning over his father's face, wept and kissed him. He commanded his servants, who were physicians, to embalm his father. So they embalmed Israel. They took 40 days to complete this, for embalming takes that long. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household, 'If I have found favor with you, please tell Pharaoh that my father made me take an oath, saying, I am about to die. You must bury me in the tomb that I made for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, then I will return.' So Pharaoh said, 'Go and bury your father in keeping with your oath.' Then Joseph went to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went with him, along with all Joseph's family, his brothers, and his father's family. Only their dependents, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. Horses and chariots went up with them. It was a very impressive procession. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, which is across the Jordan, they lamented and wept loudly, and Joseph mourned 7 days for his father. When the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, 'This is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians.' Therefore the place is named Abel Mizraim. It is across the Jordan. So Jacob's sons did for him what he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave at Machpelah in the field near Mamre, which Abraham had purchased as burial property from Ephron the Hittite. After Joseph buried his father, he returned to Egypt with all his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father." So Joseph responded to the death of his father much like people have responded to the death of loved ones for many years. I mean, for basically since people have been alive. We see that he was weeping, and we see that he kissed his father. And Joseph, because of his position in the Egyptian government, and because of the practice of the Egyptians, he was able to have his servants embalm his father Jacob. And the decision to do so was a wise decision on Jacob's part. Although that wasn't customary in Hebrew tradition of the time, or in the Canaanite traditions of that time, what it did was it allowed for his family, for Jacob's family, to take Jacob back to Canaan without the worries of decomposition or odors or animals pursuing their caravan. And so it was a wise decision considering the distance, because it would take, at minimum 2 weeks for them to travel from Egypt to Canaan. So it's going to take at least 2 weeks, and we can imagine the issues that would come along had he not been embalmed. But we're told that it took 40 days to embalm him, and the mourning period was a total of 70 days. And so once all of that was finished, after they finished embalming him, they mourned him a complete month more after that. But after those 70 days, after the mourning period was over, Joseph requested of Pharaoh to allow him to take Jacob's body back to Canaan for burial, and then Joseph said he would return. Now, I've told you guys that one of the things that I encourage you to do when we study like we're studying 1 Timothy, or if you're in our Sunday school class, we're talking about reading the book of James a chapter at a time, or reading the same chapter every day until we cover that chapter. I've been reading the chapter 50 of Genesis for a couple of weeks now, since our last Bible study. And one of the things that sticks out to me, and I did not have the opportunity to look this up to see if it's right or not, but something about the way that this reads gives me the impression, and this is just my thought from reading it, is that there must have been a new Pharaoh in Egypt because of the way that this reads, because Joseph doesn't go and ask Pharaoh as his number 2 in command to let him take his father. He asked Pharaoh's household, and then Pharaoh sent a message back to Joseph. And so this is completely Pastor Nick, reading and sort of trying to read between the lines. I wonder, and I will try my best to try and find out the answer, and we may not be able to, but I wonder if there wasn't a new Pharaoh in Egypt, that the one Joseph had worked with and served under had died, and a new one had replaced him. And Joseph was well thought of in Egyptian society because of what he had done, but Joseph at this point may not have been the number 2 in Egypt. He had been during the famine. And so that was just something that, as I read that, it just sort of it sort of stuck out to me, because it says that when the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household. If Joseph is the number 2 man in Egypt, and the only person he reports to is Pharaoh, because that's the way Pharaoh said it, basically, I'm the number 1 guy, you're the number 2 guy. If that were still the case, Joseph wouldn't have had to speak to Pharaoh's household. If you find out the truth on that and can find out something while I try and study, that's interesting, but that is something that sort of stuck out to me about it. But regardless of how it works out, Pharaoh agrees to let Joseph take his father and go and bury him in Canaan. Now, the interesting thing is that, and this may be another additional point to this, is that Joseph wasn't allowed to take Jacob by himself. He was accompanied by Egyptian elders and people from Egyptian society. Now, that could have been because of his place in Egyptian society, but it could have also been a watchful eye from Pharaoh, making sure that Joseph came back. They didn't just stay in the land of Canaan, because Joseph at this point is technically still a slave. I mean, he's been bought and sold into Egypt as a slave. Now, anyway, Pharaoh agrees. He sends the servants and elders with him, and Jacob's family go all the way back to Canaan, that 2-week trip minimum. And the only people who remained in the land of Goshen were Joseph's brothers and Joseph's kids and their flocks and animals. That basically the grandkids and the animals stayed in Egypt and Goshen, and everybody else went to bury him. And the interesting thing is, it talks about how magnificent this procession is. It's honestly as if Jacob gets the burial as if he were a head of state. I mean, that's really what this is like. It gets a lot of attention. And so they reached a place called Atad, and there was a threshing floor there for processing grain. And it's described as a place across the Jordan. Now, there is discussion, and we don't know exactly, we don't know where Atad was, but there's discussion when it says across the Jordan. Was that across the Jordan to the east, sort of in the modern state or country of Jordan, or was it across the Jordan in Israel? And I read a couple things this week that said there's no real way of knowing what Moses meant when he said that, but it got me thinking again that if Moses is writing this during the wilderness time in 40 years during the wilderness, if he's writing this down, then to him across the Jordan is over in Israel or in the Promised Land. And so we don't know where Atad was exactly, but it makes absolutely no sense for Joseph and his big entourage and this big funeral procession to come up into Israel, go across the Jordan, and then mourn, and then come back into Canaan to bury him. It just doesn't make sense. So most likely, this is Pastor Nick's perspective on it, Atad was in the land of Israel, Canaan, that region. But nevertheless, that's where they come to. They have this, extensive time of mourning. There's another week of mourning here. And while they're there, the Canaanites, the local Canaanites, take notice of them. That not only this big funeral procession, but this week-long mourning event, which was customary, even back as far as Methuselah. It's believed that the 7 days between Methuselah's death, and his name means after he dies, basically judgment. The 7 days after his death to the flood, the start of the flood is believed to have been a week-long mourning period in Jewish tradition. So this is a week-long mourning period was not uncommon. It was actually very common. But because of this mourning period there at Atad, the place was renamed Abel Mizraim. So I'm going to get you to class participation. Ready? Say Mizraim. You have just said Egypt in Hebrew. I don't remember a whole lot from my Hebrew classes, but that is one word because I was like, that is pretty cool. I did learn some things. But that is, as you read it there in your scriptures, M-I-Z-R-A-I-M, Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. And so, and it looks way weirder in Hebrew than it does in English, but that is what that is. That's what it is. And so they named this place the Mourning of Egypt because of this time of mourning that was going on. And so Joseph and his brothers buried Jacob in the cave at Machpelah and then returned to Egypt. You see here on the screen, they would have come most likely near Beersheba, headed towards the tomb of what is now called the Tomb of the Patriarchs, but the Tomb of the Patriarchs is in Hebron, and that's a region or a place where Abraham and his family had been. You'll see here you've seen this picture before in this study. This is the monument, the structure that is over the actual cave that is in the ground, and it's below this. It's called the it's basically Abraham Mosque in Hebron. This is because of the connection with Ishmael and the Muslims. This was at one point a Muslim-controlled area. But this right here is the cenotaph. It's basically a monument over the portion of the cave, which is actually under the building where Jacob is buried. There is actually, if you go online, I wouldn't advise you to do it now because we're having Bible study, but if you go on the internet, you can find a picture and it shows you this. It looks like not even a scuttle hole like you'd have in a house. It's more like a porthole on a boat. I mean, it's about that big around, and it's glass and got metal in it. But that is the view where you can actually look down into the cave. Now, you obviously aren't going to see the bodies or the bones and things like that, but that is, there may be other entrances, but I know that you can find that because I saw that during my research, and I had seen that before. But anyway, that's sort of the monument inside the Tomb of the Patriarchs. Now, if you're ever in Hebron, you can go to it, you can tour it, you can see the cenotaph for all 6 of the individuals from Jewish history or biblical history that are buried there. But that is where Jacob would have been buried is in what's called the Cave of the Patriarchs. So Jacob is buried in Canaan, and now Joseph and his brothers, as we're told there at the end of that set of the text, we're told that, and all who had gone with him to bury his family went back to Egypt. So let's look at verses 15 through 21. And we're going to look at how Joseph's brothers were at it again, trying to manipulate and mislead their brother. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph. Please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children and be comforted. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So now that Jacob is dead, now that dad is no longer in the picture, Joseph's brothers were worried that Joseph was going to exact revenge on them because of selling him into slavery and all the hardship that he had faced. And, if Joseph is still the second in command, which we don't 100% know, he would have still had some pull in Egyptian society. And so his brothers had a legitimate concern that, he's got the power to do whatever he wants with us, and we really hurt him. We sold him. We heard him crying out not to sell him and all of these things. And so Joseph probably could have arranged for them to have been sold into slavery, put into prison, or possibly even be executed. He probably could pull the strings and make that happen. So Joseph's brothers are thinking about this, and what do? They sent their brother a text message, right? It's a text message. Okay. Pun intended. But they sent him a message saying that, basically, Dad said this before he died, forgive your brothers. I mean, that's basically what they're told. And they were hoping that would lessen Joseph's anger or wrath towards them. And they hoped that the way to accomplish that was by putting words in their dead father's mouth, so to speak. And so Jacob, from what we see in the scriptures, he was willing to call out Reuben on his deathbed, and he was willing to, basically call out Levi and Simeon and others. Had Jacob just seemed like he was the type that would have told Joseph what he intended to say. He wouldn't have passed a message along through his brothers or through his sons. And so, his brothers are trying to do this, and not only do they share this message, but they come to Joseph and actually bow down in front of him and basically offer themselves up as slaves. And so maybe they're thinking that this will be more merciful. If we're Joseph's slaves, he might be, easier on us. But at that moment, Joseph makes a statement that many believers have leaned on and relied on because they've been in very similar situations where people have sought to bring harm to them, but God used it for good. And, Joseph says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? He says, you planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And so this shows you that Joseph truly was a man that understood God's plans, God's interaction in his life, and everything that had gone on. And that I think this shows us that Joseph, including his dad and his brothers, Joseph was head and shoulders above them spiritually because of the way that he approached things. And what Joseph did was he responded as we would have expected him. He treated them kindly. He spoke to them kindly, so that wasn't a big deal. But what we find is that, after this conversation between him and his brothers, we pick up at in verses 22 through 26, which round out the book of Genesis, but we have fast forwarded 54 years, as we said earlier. And so let's look at verses 22 through 26 with the understanding that we've gone 54 years into the future here. It says, Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation. The sons of Manasseh's son Machir were recognized by Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. So after they returned to Egypt, and after Joseph's brothers, are trying to lessen the damage or the wrath of their brother, what we find is that Joseph and the rest of Jacob's family remained in Egypt rather than going back to Canaan. And Joseph lived for another 54 years after the death of his father and passed away at 110. From what we read there in the scriptures, we see that Joseph saw his great-great-grandsons on Ephraim's side of the family and his great-grandsons from Manasseh. And so Joseph, just like his father Jacob, had this moment where, it was probably a blessing from God that he realized that his time was coming to an end. And he told, it says in the scriptures that he made the sons of Israel to promise to take him back to Canaan. And here's the catch when you read that. I've done some reading on this before, and I even saw it when I was studying for this particular lesson. When it says the sons of Israel, that is more of a reference to the nation of Israel rather than his 11 brothers. But the only two brothers that are believed to have still been alive would have been Levi and Benjamin. All of his other brothers who were older than him would have already passed away. Even though Levi was older than him, it's believed that Levi and Benjamin were the only two that outlived Joseph. But he made them promise, and the descendants of the sons of Israel promised to take him back and bury him in Canaan. And so in this moment that he is, at death's door, much like his father, he had an opportunity, or God gave him the ability to prophesy in this moment. And he told him, he says, Joseph explained how this could come about, how he could be buried in Canaan. He says, when God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. And so, that's obviously implying that something's going to happen. They're going to need God's help. And then when they leave Egypt, they need to take the bones of Joseph with them. And we know, as we've talked about previously in this study, and as we know happens in the book of Exodus, that's exactly what happens. Right there you can see these are pictures of the same place because Joseph is buried in Shechem, or it's actually the modern-day city of Nablus, because Shechem is not the name of the city now. But this old photograph from the late 1800s is what the tomb of Joseph looked like back then, and this is what it looks like on the inside, even just as much as 11 years ago. But my guess is that this right here is not like a vault where you could open it up and there's the tomb. That's probably a cenotaph over the place where he's actually buried. But if you're ever in Nablus in Israel, you can actually go and visit. I believe you can visit the tomb of Joseph. I think it's in Jewish-controlled areas and not by Palestinian groups. But anyway, so that's where Joseph is buried. As we know in the book of Exodus, they take the bones of Joseph with them. So, each night that we've been studying Genesis for the last 3 years, we have ended looking at lessons that we could learn from the text and how that applies to our life. And tonight, Genesis 50 is no different, because what we learn here is that God can use our mistakes for his good. That, sort of like what I was talking with the kids about this morning, is that, during children's sermon. Even though we mess up, God forgives us, and we need to repent and move forward in a right direction with Him. But that's what He can do, is He can use our mistakes. He can even use our sin to bring about His good or His plan. Now, I'm going to read a text to you from Romans that I'm sure you've all heard or maybe even could quote from memory. But Romans 8:28 says this: "We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to His purpose." And I think that we would all agree that the story of Joseph, everything from his time in Canaan and being sold into slavery up until the death of not just Jacob, but also the death of Joseph. This is a prime example of God working His situation, working Joseph's situation to accomplish God's good in a very powerful way. And the prime lesson that we see in his story, not just here in chapter 50, is that the sin of his brothers did not keep God from accomplishing His plan for the people of Egypt, but also the nation of Israel. Because obviously selling Joseph into slavery is against God's design for human relationships in any way. Slavery is not something that is condoned in any way, but God was able to use the brothers' sinful actions against Joseph for God's good, for His good. And so I want you to think about these results. Joseph was in a position to save thousands or maybe even millions of people from starvation during the famine. By Jacob moving his family to from Israel, what we see is, or to Egypt, it helped Israel grow into a large nation that they may not have been able to do on the limited grazing lands in the Negev and southern Israel. But in Egypt, they're given the best land for people who raise livestock. Plus, God was able to receive glory from the 10 plagues that would eventually happen as a result of Israel in Egypt, and by the parting of the Red Sea. And God was also able to give the Israelites the law and the promised land, rules to govern the nation and their religion, and a place for them to continue to grow. So He was able to give them not just part of the southern end of Israel, but able to give them the whole land of Canaan, so to speak. So how we look at that is, when you and I choose not to obey God, it doesn't mean that it's the end of what He can do through our situation. It doesn't mean that we tie God's hands based on our poor choices or our sinful reactions. Because although God is not pleased with our sin, He can still use our situation to bring about the completion of His plan. And so there's a saying that I've seen several times in the last probably month on social media that says, when God put a calling on your life, He already factored in your stupidity. And that's very heartwarming, especially to pastors. I'll just say that that God knows how we're going to mess up from time to time. But along that same vein of thought, God's plan for us has our sinfulness already factored in, because God is omniscient and He already knows how we'll sin and when we'll sin and what we're going to do that could potentially mess up His plan for good. So think about it. He's already built in an adjustment because of our, we'll say, sinfulness. And so He can still use our poor decisions, our sin, and our rebellion against Him to bring about His good through His plan. And so we still shouldn't test Him, and we should still try to do our best and follow Him. So if we try earnestly to follow God and grow in our relationship with Him, there will be times when we mess up. Does anybody have it all together and never mess up, never sin? No, we don't, right? It's the reality of our existence. There's going to be times when we mess up. But we don't have to beat ourselves up over it, but instead what we need to do is repent. We need to ask for His forgiveness and do what is right moving forward, just sort of like what we were talking about at children's sermon this morning. And what we'll find is that He'll use our mistakes and still bring about His good and His plan. So that is the end of our study, in not just in Genesis 50, but in the book of Genesis. So for those of you that have stuck it out with us for the last 3 years in the book of Genesis, thank you. I hope that you've learned some stuff. After our new study that starts next week, which is quiz time, Bible trivia, after we finish that series, we're going to pick up in the book of Exodus. And so we're going to sort of just keep flowing with the timeline here with what's going on. So typically, I ask if there are any questions, and Miss Alta has already beat you to the punch. She texted me like a month ago a question for tonight, which is great because she sent it in text. I didn't have to try and remember it from a conversation, and it worked out great. So this is the first question, and I'm going to answer it, and I don't know that it'll answer your questions, but if you have other questions, we'll take those. So here is what Alta texted me. Pastor Nick, you're the greatest pastor ever. No, that's not what, I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed to read that part, was I? No, I'm just picking. I got her, though. All the time she stumps me with tough questions, I got her. Okay, so, I'm sorry. so wait a minute. Excuse me. I did not have that planned, Alta, I promise. It just came to me off the cuff. Okay, so here's Alta's question. Why was he, talking about Joseph, why was he not taken to Canaan at death, like Jacob was taken and buried there? Was it because of his status as second in command and considered as royalty? Did he have a royal funeral and burial in Egypt? And so the answer to that question is we don't know 100%. We don't know why, but there are a few theories on answering that question. One theory is something that I sort of alluded to a few moments ago, in the fact that because Joseph had been sold into slavery in the land of Canaan, and then he was in Potiphar's house, and then he was in Pharaoh's house. Just because he was made second in command of Egypt and was the second most powerful man in Egypt, he was still a slave. And technically he would have been Pharaoh's slave at that point. But his body was owned by Pharaoh. Even his bones would have been owned by Pharaoh as his slave. It was his right to do with his body because it was his property. He owned him and could do whatever he wanted to. And so when a later Pharaoh released all of the Israelite slaves from Egypt during the time of Moses, Joseph and his bones would have been considered the same. So that's one theory on why Joseph wasn't taken back to Canaan immediately, is because he was still property of Pharaoh and would have been passed down from Pharaoh to Pharaoh as in ownership. Another theory is that Joseph could have had an elaborate burial like Jacob, but he chose to wait and be buried in Israel once Israel was redeemed. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that it was, this is sort of, after reading some this week, or in the past couple of weeks on this, I kind of tend to lean towards this answer, that it was a matter of, it was part of God's plan for Joseph to prophesy to the Israelites, hey, God's going to come to your rescue, and then you take my bones out. Had they buried Joseph in Canaan, or even in Shechem, in that region, right after he died, Joseph would have never prophesied that there's a time coming where God is going to deliver you. And they would have not had that promise. They would have not had that prophecy. So that's probably my best answer, or my best guess, is that it was a matter of, yes, he did have they would have done a burial. They would have embalmed him and done all those things in Egypt. But the reason I think that, from just knowing what the scriptures say and what we've talked about tonight, the reason Joseph wasn't taken back immediately is it's part of God's plan. It was part of God's plan to give Israel the confidence that their slavery in Egypt would not be forever, that there would come an end. God would deliver you, and when he delivers you, you need to take Joseph back and bury him. Now, there are a couple of traditions, though, that talk about Joseph's burial in Egypt. And so there's two that surround the idea that Joseph was buried in a metal coffin, and his coffin was sunk in the Nile River. And the reason for that was to keep, that the thought or the belief in this tradition is that what happened was because of Joseph's prophecy that God would deliver and the Israelites would be able to leave, that some of Pharaoh's I guess you would say advisors thought that it would be better to be able to keep the Israelites in Egypt. So what they did was they sunk Joseph's body in a metal coffin in the Nile so that nobody could ever retrieve it, and it would never, his bones would never leave Egypt. Now, that's a tradition. I don't know that it's true. I just don't know. But there are two traditions that speak of Moses floating the coffin of Joseph by either his words or actions. Don't know. It's probably just a medieval tradition that came about. I don't know that there's any truth in that, right? And I wouldn't even lean on that. But here is something really interesting, and I want to thank Alta for asking this question because I would have never known this. I'm going to try and look it up and see if I can find it. But there was a documentary that aired in 2016, so only about 9 years ago, stating that they had found 12 elaborate tombs in the believed area of Goshen, in which we would naturally correlate that to the sons of Israel. That Joseph and his brothers were buried in these tombs. But what they say is that the most elaborate crypt was a small pyramid containing an unusually large statue with skin painted yellow, red hair, and a multicolored robe. So that we naturally jump to the fact that this could, or the thought that this could be Joseph. But here's the interesting thing: that particular tomb was empty. There were no bones in it. And why is that? If that is Joseph's, because his are in Shechem, not in Egypt. So you can find this if you go look at theisraelbible.com and ask, and look for it here. I've got a link that I can send it to you. But I'm going to try and look up that particular documentary and see what it says. But again, we don't know for 100% certainty that that's where Joseph was buried. But that would make sense that if he was number 2 in Egypt, that they would have given him a more elaborate crypt than his brothers and gone from there. So that is my very long answer to Miss Alta's great question earlier. But are there any other questions that you have this evening concerning either the study in Genesis or tonight's text in Genesis 50? Yes, ma'am. That's a good point. I never read anything about that, but that makes complete sense. That if you didn't hear Joyanne, what she was saying was that J. Vernon McGee, in his commentary on this particular part of the text, says that Jacob was embalmed. Joseph had his physicians to embalm rather than the Egyptian priest who normally, and that's a historical fact, that the priests in Egypt were the ones that typically did the embalming. And so the reason J. Vernon McGee mentions that the priest didn't do this and the physicians did is basically so that they couldn't say that Joseph or that Jacob was embalmed according to Egyptian religious practices, that his faith was Egyptian rather than worship of the one true God. So that's a good insight. I hadn't thought about that. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. That's a good observation. If you didn't hear David, what he was saying was making reference to where Joseph asked for Pharaoh's permission through the household or through the court of Pharaoh. That would make sense that he would have to go through the proper channels if he was still a slave, despite being potentially still the number 2 man in Egypt. So that's a good observation. I didn't think about that either. So, any other questions or comments this evening? Yeah. If you didn't hear Rob, what he was saying was that Joseph is a prime example of the influence that mom and dad can have on us, because he was Joseph's or Jacob's favorite, but then his circumstances taught him that he had to rely on God and not on dad's favoritism, I think is a good way of looking at it. Any other questions or comments? Those are some good ones. All right. Well, I appreciate you sticking it out with us in the book of Genesis. We're going to do the same thing in the book of Exodus. We're going to take it in chunks. The first section of Exodus will be looking at basically Moses, the plagues, and Pharaoh, starting up to the actual Exodus. And so that's where we'll start. After we have our new Bible study starting next week, what we'll do for the next 4 Sunday nights that we have Sunday night services, because it does go around Easter when we don't have, and 5th Sunday night in March. There'll be 2 weeks in the next 6 that we don't have Sunday evening service. But the other 4, when we have our Sunday night service, we're going to have probably the most interactive Bible study I've ever had, and we're going to do quiz time Bible trivia. So we're going to have 4 different lessons. The first one is going to be on the books of the Bible, so start studying now. The second one is going to be on the people of the Bible. The third one will be on the places of the Bible, and the fourth one will be on the miracles of the Bible. And so here's how this particular Bible study will operate. When we come in on Sunday nights, there will be on the back banisters, there will be a scorecard, a piece of paper for you to write down your answers, much like we do on the first night of an introduction Bible study. There's going to be, but instead there's going to be 20 questions and a tiebreaker. What we are going to do is ask for 2 volunteers to come up on the stage and share their answers during the game, or play the game from the stage, and everybody else gets to sit in the seats. So if you're up for the trivia game, then we would love for you to be a part of that. At the end of the questioning, we'll go back through and answer the questions and see which one of our participants has the better score and who in the congregation has the better score. And our folks at home will even be able to keep score at home for themselves. And so that will be how we'll operate for the next 4 weeks. So next Sunday is going to be nothing but about the books of the Bible. And so, it'll be a good time. So we'll just leave it at that. So hope that you'll be here for that. And if you're even the slightest bit interested in being a participant, go for it. It'll be fun. We'll have a good time. So hope that you'll be here for the next few weeks as we do that. And then we'll get back into the book, or we'll get into the book of Exodus following that. And so I want to remind you that Wednesday night is missions night. Our WMU will be meeting in the choir room, and our Baptist men will be meeting out here. And then next Sunday morning, we're going to start our walk to Easter, so to speak, through a sermon series looking at each of the different Gospels' account of the last day of Jesus' life. In the past, I've taught a sermon series, or preached a sermon series, where it was the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, and we've pulled from each of the different ones to sort of paint the picture. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at each Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and their account of Jesus' last day, and talk about that in the next few weeks leading up to Easter. So that'll be on Sunday morning, and then the following Wednesday night we'll be in 1 Timothy. So I hope that you'll be a part of all those services going forward. So I'm going to ask Joseph, if he would, to close us out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.